Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today, flying the A Fork in Time What If machine solo. It's going to take a quick trip down a historical what if that is, I think, somewhat interesting. And actually, the fact that we're going to take a quick trip is actually one of the most important things about the alternate history topic that we're going to talk about today, because the very existence of the thing that we're going to be talking about that would not be in existence in the historical what if leads to a much quicker trip. Today, here on A Fork in Time, we're going to explore what would things have been like, or how would history have run differently if there were no such thing as the Panama Canal. So before we come back to set up the historical what did and the historical what if, we'll just take a quick pause here to hear from one of the folks that helped make the show possible. And when we come back, we'll pick up the historical what if journey of what if there had been, or what if there weren't, a Panama Canal.
Would groceries delivered to you in as fast as 1 hour save you a trip to the store? Instacart makes that possible thanks to personal shoppers in your area who hand-select items based on your preferences from the stores you love. And shopping multiple stores is possible on a single order. Instacart picks the freshest produce and even keeps your eggs safe, all while finding everything you usually buy, providing smart suggestions for new items, and even highlighting deals to help you save money. And now you get free delivery on your first order over $35. Let Instacart know we sent you and help support our show by following the link in the show notes. Instacart. Groceries delivered in as fast as 1 hour.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today. And as we introduced before we left there for the break, today we're going to explore, just take a little quick trip down the scenario where what if there had been no Panama Canal, or if the Panama Canal didn't exist today. Actually, as I was thinking about and preparing for this episode, it occurred to me that it's one of those things that we just absolutely take for granted. And I assume that most people that are listening certainly understand what the Panama Canal is, where it is, and why it's of importance. But it's probably valuable to do the historical what did, because one of the things that occurred to me is that we don't often think about just how recent in terms of history the existence of the Panama Canal is, and because of its import and how we take it for granted today. Of course, the Panama Canal was completed and opened for traffic in 1914 after several decades of construction, a project initially begun by the French and taken over by the United States, and that was to build a waterway across the relatively short distance of the Isthmus of Panama that would connect the Caribbean Sea, and thus out to the Atlantic Ocean, directly to the Pacific. And so it was designed, and it does function today as creating a tremendous shortcut in terms of nautical traffic that is trying to get from the Atlantic side of North, Central, and South America to the Pacific side of North, Central, and South America. And approximate distance that's saved by the Panama Canal in terms of if you sail the entire duration around, or the length around South America, is about 7,800 nautical miles. And so we're talking about, depending upon the speed of the vessel here, weeks of transport, even with modern vessels that are powered by modern propulsion systems. And of course, we're talking about a tremendous amount, not only of distance, but time that's saved. And so it's obvious that it's great to have a shortcut that enables a ship traveling from the Pacific, or I probably will constantly use the Atlantic. Technically, we're talking about the Caribbean here, on the Atlantic side of the American continents. But moving quickly across a fairly short duration of less than a day in terms of the transit of the canal versus sailing all the way around South America, or obviously having to circumnavigate the globe in the entire other direction to get there. And so as we start looking at the historical what-ifs of if there had been no Panama Canal, there's a couple of areas that we can settle into. And so probably going to focus on 3 of those areas as we move forward. The first and probably most obvious area is just how it changes the way that commerce and trade functions if you don't have a Panama Canal. It's just simply not as easy to move goods by sea around the world, or at least the patterns that we know now for trade would be very different. And so one of the first obvious what-ifs would be the fact that you would have less traffic that is moving in the patterns that it are now. So what does that really mean? Well, if you think about the types of things that move through the canal now and how they work, it's much easier, for example, for ships and traffic that are sailing from Asia to be able to reach ports in the United States that are not on the West Coast. And so, for example, when it comes to the import and export, for example, of a primary commodity like crude oil, being one good example, to the United States and from the United States from Asia, or as we're seeing now more and more with the rise of liquefied natural gas and the export from the United States of liquefied natural gas and petroleum from ports, for example, along the Gulf of Mexico, it greatly changes the timing and the economics of how that would work. And so the obvious thing in terms of how trade and commerce would work today is that just using the United States as an example and the ports that have risen to prominence in the United States today, is you would see more specialization in what those ports would do. Certainly, there are West Coast ports in the United States that are major ports, but they would have to be much larger and handling different types of cargo than they do today in order to be able to meet imports from Asia and exports to Asia and points across the Pacific. I use Asia there broadly, but just points across the Pacific. And so, for example, I think one of the big what-ifs you would see is you would see a much larger presence of ports in Western North America, Western Canada, the Western United States, the ports in Los Angeles and San Francisco, potentially in San Diego and Seattle, and other places. Portland would be much larger than they are today. And that's interesting because one of the unique aspects of the West Coast, for example, just of the United States, is the absence, at least in terms of how things have developed, are as many ports. There aren't as many natural places where there are good harbors and places to establish ports. And so you would actually find the places where it is possible, Los Angeles being one example of that, probably needing to be a much larger port if we think about the way that goods flow back and forth. Now, that's assuming that everything about trade is the same now without the Panama Canal as it was or is with the Panama Canal. And what I would argue is that it's sort of a false assumption to assume that we would have the same trade patterns if you had different trade routes. In other words, that what we're accustomed to now in terms of what is imported and exported, again using the Pacific aspect of the canal right now, would be very different. Would the United States be as much of a trading partner with Asian ports if the only access to that were via a smaller, more limited number of Western ports for Western North America, the Western United States, then the ability now with just as much relative ease, really about not more than another 7 to 10 days of travel for a ship to arrive, let's say, in the port of New Orleans or the port of Houston, as it would be for the port of Los Angeles. And so one of the things I think that definitely would be different under this what-if scenario is our trade patterns. And those trade patterns would be different such that we may not even recognize the trade patterns that would exist when we compare them to the trade patterns that exist today. And certainly if we did have the same amount of trade going on, for example, between Asian nations like China and the United States, they would be coming through different routes and into different ports, and that would greatly change the dynamic, particularly the value of Western port cities. I think you would have more large populous areas on the West Coast, and certainly many of those would be centered around the existing places where ports exist or the new places where ports might be built. But actually, in even discussing it that way, that sort of tends to be, unfortunately, and I recognize this, sort of an American-centric view. The assumption is that there would be something that would need to be different about ports in the western United States. But there's an entire North, Central, and South American continent that borders on the Pacific Ocean. And so one of the questions that logically gets asked is, to what extent would other nations, Mexico, the other nations of Central America, even South America, would they have more of a stake in trade or the way that commerce flowed because of their ports that would be on the Pacific, and thus were shorter sailing distances, shorter trade routes to exchange goods back and forth across the Pacific? Would there be more of a financial gain for Mexico? Would there be more of a financial gain just for the various countries in Central America where items would have to be brought by ship to there and then transitioned onto other means and modes of cargo transportation, either to be carried across to the Atlantic side of the American continents and then transitioned back onto ship? Or would there just be more traffic, of course, that would then circumnavigate around the entire southern route all the way around the South American continent? I would quickly argue that what you saw before the port was that you did have the situation where there were truck and rail routes that were connected from one side of the continent to the other that crossed there in Panama. Panama and Nicaragua and some of the other places there had that scenario before the canal of ships being unloaded on one side of the Atlantic or the Pacific side, and then the cargo being transferred across by rail or by some other conveyance, even by wagon back in the day, and then reloaded on ships on the other side of the continent. Certainly, I think you would see much more modern versions of those types of interim transportation systems, even if you didn't have the canal. And so one advantage might be that Panama, being one of the shorter durations, for example, or one of the shorter distances across there on the isthmus, part of the reason it works well for the canal might be that Panama might have grown to be even more of a thriving economic power, not because a canal passed through it, but because trade had to move across it. And so that you would have several ports on both sides of Panama or other Central American countries that would thrive, and then you would have the vast transportation systems that would develop between those two ports and between those two hubs, such that it wouldn't just be the benefit of tolling and the economic value of vessels that were passing through the country, but of all the goods that were passing through the country, and how that would actually cause that economy to be even more prosperous in terms of being the connection point between the east and west there, between the Atlantic and the Pacific sides of the American continent. And so that particular aspect of the historical what if, just how trade and nautical transportation and those types of things would be different, is pretty obvious. But to me, the more important what ifs to explore are actually sort of the more subtle what ifs that go back historically. Because what I've suggested there is how it's impacted world trade, and there's no doubt the Panama Canal has impacted world trade by reducing that transit around South America and making both parts or both sides of North, South, and Central America easily accessible, either both to Europe and Africa or to the Asian Pacific parts of the world. But when you really think about the unique position of the United States, particularly as an economic power, it's important to realize that the Panama Canal was incredibly important to the growth and expansion of the United States. Prior to the opening in 1914, there were really only two ways to get, for example, from New York to San Francisco or New York to Los Angeles. One of those was to cross the United States. At that point, that would have been by the early days of car transportation, but more importantly by rail, coming all the way across from the eastern coast of the United States, from the Atlantic seaboard to the western seaboard, or to board a ship and then sail around South America. Of course, by the early part of the 20th century, you are much more likely to do that by train and certainly by automobile than you would have been by ship, unless you needed to transport something by ship. But the realization that some things are very difficult to transport in terms of commercial things are very difficult to transport by rail or by ground transportation such as large truck, that it really does change the nature of how the economics really inside the United States work, not just with respect to the United States or to other North American countries in trading with the world, but particularly for the United States, given the width and size of the country, to be able to trade with itself. And so, for example, the importance of being able to move cargo easily, and let's say an example being from a port like New Orleans around to the port of Los Angeles, where that's a very, relatively speaking, short trip down through the Gulf of Mexico, through the Caribbean, through the canal, and then quickly up the Pacific coast of Mexico to the Pacific coast of the United States. That's a relatively short trip to do by boat, by cargo vessel. So if it's something like oil, for example, that needs to be transported, that's an easier thing to do by ship, and it's a fairly short journey. If you try to do that without the existence of the Panama Canal, you either have that much, much longer trek around South America, or you're limited to moving things that are going to move well or more easily by rail. So it's not to say, for example, that oil can't be shipped by rail, but it's far more efficient to ship something like oil, for example, from a port in New Orleans or from the port of Houston, than it is to Los Angeles or to San Francisco than it is to do that similar action by rail. And so that changes the economics, not just of global trade, but changes the economics of trade even within the United States, when you realize that things that are going from a U.S. city to a U.S. city very often move by ship and by vessel, and they do so because they're able to take the relatively short trip to the Panama Canal versus the much longer trip that would be taken by going across South America. And so one of the things that I would argue that would be very different if there were not a Panama Canal is that the nature of U.S. internal commerce would even be different, not even factoring in the external commercial aspects of not having the canal in place. When you take that further, imagine the situation like existed in a military conflict like World War II, where one of the things the United States was able to do during that conflict was it was able to move naval vessels relatively quickly from their Atlantic Fleet deployment to a Pacific Fleet deployment. They could move from the Atlantic to the Pacific in a matter of a couple of weeks by transiting through the Panama Canal versus several weeks or a month or longer by transiting all the way around South America. So from the position of being able, during that particular conflict, just using that as one example during World War II, the United States was able to be much more effective in its use of its naval forces in a two-theater conflict, moving those forces from the Atlantic theater to the Pacific theater in a relatively short amount of time compared to what would have been required to reposition them without the Panama Canal. When you think of just that fact alone and its impact on how, especially the early portion of World War II played out in terms of its naval situation, that's a very dramatic and a very powerful thing. In fact, even in the period of time before the Second World War, the United States had designed the very nature of how its Navy would work, understanding that it had that level of flexibility after 1914 to be able to take advantage of the Panama Canal as a mode of transit in being able to move those military forces. So it had been factored in to how the Navy existed, the United States Navy existed before World War II, and certainly it was an important aspect of what took place during the war and then, of course, subsequent to the war. And so it's one of those things when you look at both the internal trade inside of the United States as well as what it enabled the United States to do in terms of its military projection, its naval military projection, both for defense as well as offense during World War II, and then in the post-war era, as it was dealing with conflicts around the world, the flexibility of not having a 3 to 4 week transit around South America enabled more military flexibility. It also enabled the United States economy to be a more unified economy by being able to take advantage of a fairly short sea route from the East Coast to the West Coast that enabled the economy to be more integrated and to be more powerful as a result. Finally, the last thing is also one of those important areas to look at that is sort of the indirect impact of what we just saw here, and that's if the United States economy is not as dominant internally because it doesn't have some of the advantages of a short sea transportation route to link its two coasts, which are far apart, who benefits? In other words, in a situation where the United States is less influential, sort of in a zero-sum game, and somebody actually has to come out ahead. And I would argue that there are some potential players, particularly the Central American players, who could have found themselves in a much stronger position. I've already mentioned before just the advantages that a Panama might have had of being even more economically benefited without a canal than they are with a canal because of the amount of commerce that would have had to cross the isthmus, being transferred by other means from one port to another versus passing through Panama and the advantages of the canal. The other thing to realize is that many of those goods probably would actually stop. They wouldn't necessarily cross, and they would find other destinations. And so imagine that you would have particularly this, there's not as much opportunity, there's not as many good locations for seaports on the western side of the two primarily American continents, the North and South American continents, but there are a number of them on the eastern parts and the northern parts of South America, for example, and then all throughout Central America and, of course, North America. And so you have the situation there where you could have had locations like Colombia. I've already mentioned Panama, but I think Mexico is another good example of this, as being nations that would have benefited from the fact that trade does not flow through a canal in Panama, and thus a lot of it gets attracted to a market like the United States, a large, powerful market, but that they would have been markets in and of themselves that would have risen to a higher place of prominence just because of the change in the trade flows and changes in the patterns. And of course, once you change the economics going back historically, the other thing that you particularly change moving forward are the politics moving forward. And so the situation where you might not have the United States being quite as dominant a manufacturing power and having the ease of having both its East Coast and its West Coast interface equally as well, both heading towards Europe, but also heading towards the Asian Pacific theater. You would have also had the scenario where others would have been able to rise to power economically, and thus the politics between the United States and some of its neighbors just to the south and further to the south in Central and South America could be very different. And so you can argue the scenario where you might have a different relationship that would exist today between the United States and Mexico because there would have been a more equalized economic footing that may have changed the political connections between the two. Or some of the things that happened later, particularly after the World War II, as we're in the Cold War era, in the 50s and the 60s, some of the nations there that looked towards and had a leaning towards socialism and communism that might have had much more thriving capitalistic economies that may have made the economics influence the politics in a way that would have been quite different. And the final thing that I would just like to focus on is actually another type of what if, which the assumption here being that eventually, just like there was a need and a benefit by building the Suez Canal, and why so many of the large canals that exist around the world come into being, is that they're inevitable in the sense of the economic impact that they have and why they get built, is the realization that while we talk about the Panama Canal, and this is a what if about what if there were no Panama Canal, we might be talking about what if there were no Panama Canal, but there were a Nicaragua Canal instead. In fact, it's a great, fascinating period of time in history to study sort of how the canal came to be in Panama. And it's not always a good story or a pleasant story to tell about some of the political machinations and revolution in Panama, which of course was a province of Colombia and being broken away. But for a long period of time, there had been a great deal of thought and effort, the fact that Nicaragua would actually be a better candidate for building the canal across because of Lake Nicaragua being a natural connection point in the middle of the nation that would have made a canal or connecting to the lake from both directions, something that you would also be able to do. But it's one of those interesting things of talking about the concerns about volcanoes, which may or may not have been a reality in terms of steering folks away from Nicaragua, or just the politics of what worked in terms of doing it in Panama, with Panama pulling away from Colombia, or the situation there, but imagining instead that it had not been Panama, but it had been Nicaragua. So many of the things that I've talked about here would have still worked, at least conceptually, with the idea that there would have been a route between the Atlantic side of the American continents and the Pacific side of the American continents, only passing through Nicaragua instead of Panama. But of course, Nicaragua would have been a very different nation, perhaps becoming the nation that Panama is today in terms of economic prowess and other things instead of or in lieu of Panama. And it's also possible that the canal being built across Nicaragua might not have been with the same influence of the United States, both in terms of building the canal, investing in building the canal, investing in doing the things that led up to Panama changing its status and Panama being the place. But you might have had a different interest and control of the canal other than the Panamanian interest, which was, of course, originally up until the transfer of the canal zone in the late 20th century. The canal itself was United States territory running through Panama that had been leased or had been part of the acquisition there that was then ultimately transferred back to the nation of Panama, such that today Panama is in control of the canal. But imagine a scenario where the canal through Nicaragua may not have been under United States control in exactly the same way. Again, the French had been initially involved in the late 19th century in the initial building and construction of the canal. So imagine there's a whole different what if that we might just explore in an entirely different episode of the podcast, where if the canal had been built in Nicaragua, perhaps under French control, you change not necessarily as much of the economics that I'm talking about or have spent so much in the early part of today's podcast talking about for the United States and Eastern ports in the Americas and Western ports in the Americas, but you may have had a different change in terms of some of the other things that would have happened had the canal been under different control. There was never a doubt when the canal was in Panama, for example, for the portion that I talked about for being able to move U.S. military naval forces from the Atlantic to the Pacific easily because the canal was under American control. What would have happened if it had been under French control and potentially had fallen into Nazi possession, or there had been some dispute over who had possession of the location? It would have been the type of thing that could have led to a scenario of, yes, there's a canal there, and yes, you've been accustomed to using it, but you can't bring your warships or your commercial traffic through that canal. And so if you look at the scenario where there's a canal in Nicaragua and not a canal in Panama, who controls the canal, the historical development of the canal and its control, those types of things could have also led to a very different alternate history. And I sort of feel we'll come back and I'll talk about that. Perhaps we'll explore that in a different episode here of A Fork in Time, because I think that's an even more fascinating thing to explore and is worthy of an episode of its own. So having said that, I'll go ahead and bring this episode of A Fork in Time to its close. And once again, we'll say what we always say and do mean this. We appreciate our listeners and thank you for joining us and giving us some of your time today. To learn more about the podcast, you can visit our website. That's www.aforkintimepodcast.com. There you can get our entire back library of past episodes. Find out a little bit more about who we are, what we do, and what A Fork in Time is all about. Certainly you can get our links there to social media and other ways to share the podcast. And if you're so inclined and would like to support the podcast financially, there's the links there that lead you to our Patreon page. So all of those are things that you can find at aforkintime.podcast.com. Also, of course, the ability to provide us feedback, and we always welcome that, what you like and don't like about episodes, suggestions for topics, and just getting acquainted with us as we seek to build the community here, as part of the alternate history community here at A Fork in Time. So as we close out today, I do want to make one correction from last week. I referenced Brody Burton, who I think we will still have on here at some point soon. Brody has his own alternate history podcast that he launched, and I made reference to that podcast, but I realized I gave you the wrong name for that podcast. So think about what ifs. I said what if. The actual name of his podcast is the Imagine If podcast. And so I am going to make a point of including in these show notes a link to where you can find that podcast. And again, as we've talked about before, it's about building a community in the alternate history space. And so as young Brody has launched off on his endeavor there to have a podcast of his own, I wanted to be supportive of him. It's also a very different approach in that he does something that we've done occasionally here on our podcast, but don't do as frequently, which is actually building out full alternate timelines. So it's not just discussing even as I have today, as we often do, more of a discussion about the historical what if. It actually produces an historical what if. And for those of you that enjoy that type of alternate timeline where it's actually more specific and not more generalized, you probably will enjoy the way that he approaches things there and give him encouragement as well. So this is Don signing off for this episode of A Fork in Time, and doing so the way that we always prefer and tend to do that, sort of taking that old Yogi Bearism and converting it over to history, which simply says that if you encounter a fork in time, take it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.